Glad to see you too this morning.
Very excited for this presentation. Junior year, big stuff on the horizon.
Always my favorite part of the year, getting to meet with new families.
Yeah. I like to joke that our lot in life is to relive junior year of high school over and over and over again. And I wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much liked my junior, minus the whole like college stress thing, but
And any
So
less
made
homework.
it your mission to make that easier on other people. How noble.
yes. Yes, and a little less math homework, especially. Like I could have done without less math homework.
There you go. Awesome. We usually get started, just so everyone knows, about a minute or two after the stated start time. You know how these Zoom things go. Sometimes your phone tells you to log on right at 11. You get the notification like, oh, shoot, I'm not at a computer. Zoom needs to update, etc. So
Always.
yeah, so we give people a couple minute grace period and then we'll jump right into the topics for today. It was quite wonderful not to have to watch the Eagles try to play football this weekend. That was great for me. Finally getting a break from that.
Less stress.
Yes, exactly.
There's always next year.
There's always next year. That's right.
And hey, at least your team was in the playoffs.
Fair enough. I won't make you admit to everyone who your team is.
Probably for the best.
All right, why don't we jump right into it? So welcome on in, everyone, to our 2024 Junior Summit webinar. We're really excited for this presentation because, as I was joking with Jordan and Alyssa before, junior year of high school is a time where a lot of things start coming to a head. Academically, it's more intense than it has been in the past. The college search is heating up. And it's a time where a presentation like this that can give you some straightforward answers to some very complicated questions can help a lot. So my name's Jim Wismer. I see from our participant list, many of you know me and have spoken to me in the past. I directly oversee our test prep and academic subject tutoring here at Ivy Experience, and I speak with most of our new families when they're getting started with us on any service. I'm joined by my colleagues, Alyssa Coltrane and Jordan Holmes. And Alyssa, why don't you introduce yourself and your role?
Sure. Good morning. Like Jim said, my name is Alyssa Coltrane. I'm the Director of College Admissions for Ivy Experience. And what that means is I help to oversee the essay side of things, and I also work with a lot of our students through every step of the application process, starting with the kind of college advising we're going to be talking a little bit about on this call, all the way through putting, the final period on the final draft of the final essay that's about to go out the door.
Awesome. And Jordan?
Hi, everyone. As Jim said, my name is Jordan Holmes. I'm the Assistant Director of College Admissions here at Ivy Experience. Similar to Alyssa, I work with our students on every part of the application process, again, from having these conversations, deciding a college list, and working on those essays and applications as well.
Awesome. So let's jump into our topics. Now, when we start conversations about anything broadly related to college advising, we like to start by just reminding you of what is in your control in this process. So students and parents, there are a lot of things in college admissions that are outside of your control. This probably isn't news to anyone, but things that might affect your college application that you have no control over would include things like what other students at your high school are doing, your demographic information, goals that a university might have for their incoming freshman class that have nothing to do with you. All those things can play a role. But the thing about those things is that any time spent worrying about them doesn't actually give you any benefit. So our view is that if you focus narrowly on these 5 realms, this is where students can really help themselves in this process. And so this is where we concentrate our advice and our guidance for students and families. So those factors are grades and the rigor of your coursework, scores on standardized tests like the SAT and ACT, AP exams, IB exams, and some others, letters of recommendation from teachers, which while students don't directly control them, they do form the relationships that form the basis of those letters. Extracurricular activities speak for themselves, and the quality of the written components of your application. So the idea is that when you're looking to improve your outcomes in this college admissions process, focusing narrowly on these 5 realms is going to be your best way to get, bang for your buck in terms of your time invested. With that, I'm going to jump right into grades and academic rigor, which are typically understood to be the most important factors in college admissions. And so historically, at just about every school, your high school transcript is sort of the centerpiece of your application. And so that means when we say rigor, we really mean the level of courses you're taking. So things like honors and AP courses are going to be, more heavily weighted in that consideration. Now, in the current college admissions landscape, what I would say, especially for admission to very selective colleges, is that grades are what I call a necessary but insufficient condition for your acceptance. And what that means is that you must have those excellent grades, but the excellent grades aren't going to get you in alone in an environment where everyone has great grades who's applying to those schools, more or less. One important note about grades, juniors, is that junior year is going to be your most important year of high school for college admissions. And there's a very common sense reason for this. It's the last full year that the admissions officers can look at. They're going to see your grades from the beginning of senior year, but they get a full year picture of who you are as a student from your junior year, which is going to be much more like college you than your freshman year was. Basic idea. Now, when I say that many other students are applying with excellent grades as well, what I'm really referring to is something that we're seeing in the college admissions world, which is grade inflation. So I have here some historical data from ACT in a report that they published, tracking the cumulative high school GPA of students who are applying to college, along with the average ACT score. And so the idea here is that you can track the trend of ACT scores and see that it's actually steadily trended downward. Now, the ACT is a standardized test, meaning that many PhD statisticians are making sure that the ACT means the same thing in 2010 that it did in 2021. High school GPA is a cultural practice. And what I mean by that is that, what constitutes an A is an individual teacher's decision. And times can change, and the sort of work that can constitute A work changes with the times. So we're in an environment now where it is more common than ever for high school students to achieve a very strong GPA. And to illustrate that point further, I have data from the University of Pittsburgh's main campus. A lot of our students are from the Philadelphia area, Pennsylvania based. Pitt is one of our flagship state schools in Pennsylvania. And you can see that I should just give the caveat that these are weighted GPAs, but 70% of the University of Pittsburgh's freshman class, according to the data that they're required to release, had over a 4.0 weighted GPA with an average GPA of 4.16. And so what that tells us is we're in an environment where the grade environment of high school admission or college admissions is more competitive than ever in a sense, because you're sort of demanded to get these excellent grades. But that also makes it a field where it's difficult to distinguish yourself because so many other students have these great grades. So it's important to have that excellent performance in the classroom. But that won't be the only factor that you can use to distinguish yourself. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about later. Now, when we talk about course selection for next year, which should be coming up for many students, I wanted to give some general guidance. Now, course selection decisions are always case by case. So I'm going to do my best to give some sort of philosophical guidance that everyone can take home today. But I will just, give the warning that decisions are going to be different for every student. Our philosophy is that students should set themselves up to be challenged, but also in an environment where they can succeed. What does that mean? We often get a question of, should I take this AP course or should I take the next level down? Very common question. Some of you are probably talking about it at home already for next year. And the question really comes down to this. If taking that AP course, if it would be your most challenging course, if, you might get an A- or a B+ instead of an A or something like that, it's your sort of weakest course and it requires the most of your time, that's still in the realm of okay. It's okay to, take a risk, challenge yourself, and have it be very difficult for you. What's not okay is if that course takes up such an undue amount of your time that your grades in your other courses suffer as a result. You don't have as much time to devote for them to just keep your head above water in that course that you were thinking about. If you're losing sleep over it and then you're unhealthy and mentally unhealthy, you're having to cut extracurricular activities that make you happy, right? For the sake of getting the work done for this course. When that course would demand such an undue amount of your time and attention, that's the point at which it makes sense to drop a level down. And we always say, be honest with yourself. You can drop a level down early enough in the school year that it would never show up on your transcript. Now, every high school is going to have a different point at which they're going to see that they were in one level class and then drop down. If you were to drop down, say, midway through the year, if you drop down a level at this time of year, you're going to see grades from the one course and grades from the other. But if you drop early enough in the year, then an admissions office wouldn't even see that you were originally enrolled in a different course. They would just see the course that you did take. So if you are feeling overwhelmed, that's something to keep a finger on the pulse of early next year to just make sure that, you don't have to make an adjustment. The other thing is, it is important to strike balance and make sure that, you're challenging yourself, but not overwhelming yourself. At the same time, we would be remiss not to mention that if you're looking for one of the most selective schools in the country, they really are expecting you to take the most challenging course load that your school offers. So you don't have as much freedom in course selection. If your single-minded goal would be to apply to, an Ivy League school or a school of that level of competitiveness, you really do have to take the most challenging load. Now, let's talk about this year. That's all for next year. Finishing 11th grade strong. The one thing I really, really recommend, I know for a lot of students, it's midterms, or if you're on a sort of half-year system, it's finals time and you're starting new courses. Think about your end-of-year finals and AP exams, those cumulative exams and assignments now. It's a lot harder from a tutoring standpoint to work with a student just the 2 weeks before the test for a bunch of cram sessions than it is to meet regularly over the course of the semester and stay on top of things. So I would say, make sure that you're considering the fact that every time you study for a test is an investment in studying for your final as well. I would say if you find yourself in that position where you're falling behind, start by reaching out to your teacher. Many teachers make themselves available after school, before school, during free periods to help students out who are struggling in a course. Another thing that can be really helpful is forming a study group or reaching out to a friend who maybe has very efficient notes. I know Alyssa experienced something like this in her AP Euro class in high school.
Yes, so I took AP Euro my junior year of high school and ended up in a very small class. There was maybe 9 or 10 of us. We ended up sort of forming a study group of our own, and I tended to read the textbook very thoroughly. I took really diligent notes. So it not only was helpful for me, but when it came time to the AP exam, and I am about to show just how old I am, I was able to burn a copy of my notes onto CD-ROMs and hand them out to my classmates so that they could then use those notes to study for the exam. It was not only helpful for them, but it was a motivating factor for me to keep taking those notes and reviewing the chapters so that, I was able to do that for them, and it helped me too on the exam. I think I ended up getting a 5. I don't remember at this point.
Yeah, so these are great methods to help yourself. Start by reaching out to the teacher, look to your friends. There might be a unit you understood really well that a friend didn't, and vice versa, and you can really help each other. If you're trying for these strategies and they don't work out, then that's sort of the point at which we look to tutoring for the next step. And so when we work with a student on school subject tutoring, we're not focused only on content review, but we really take a teach you how to fish approach, where we want to help students build the skills for them to be able to tutor themselves. The goal of a great tutor should be to make themselves irrelevant. And so we focus with students on how do you study? How are you taking notes to set yourself up for that? How are you organizing your time and your information? Sometimes when we're preparing, especially for end of year exams, it's not just about content, but also about test taking strategies. So we'll be asking students, how does your teacher test you? Preparing for a test that's primarily essays is a lot different than preparing for a multiple choice test. Some students might be more comfortable with the multiple choice format than others. So the idea is that, we want to make sure that the students understand the material to the very best of their ability. We also want to know how these teachers are grading and what their expectations are. This is especially true in an AP exam formats, because throughout the year, some teachers kind of tailor their exams more or less to the format of those APs. It's great for the students when they're practicing in a format that is like the AP exam all year. But if your teacher is not having you assessed in that AP style format all year, then it puts you in a position where you really need to get ready for that style of assessment before the test. Either way, like I said, it's always better to intervene sooner rather than later. And even with tutoring, starting tutoring sooner can mean less total time spent tutoring, because it's a lot easier to stay afloat than it is to rescue someone who's drowning, to use a terrible metaphor. With that, I'll hand it over to Jordan to talk about letters of recommendation.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Jim talked earlier about reaching out to teachers when you're struggling and you're looking for that extra help, but it's always good to reach out to teachers because letters of recommendation are always important parts of the application. They are opportunities for admission officers to learn who you are from a third party and talk about positive interactions that you have, talk about how you contribute to school communities and things like that. And they're really great ways for them to understand you outside of the ways that you're already being represented on your application. So when you go to ask a teacher as a recommender to be recommender, always make sure that you're looking at the school requirements for the schools that you're applying to. Typically, colleges will look for 1 to 2 teachers and 1 counselor, but depending on which school you're applying to, that can change. For example, at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 1 recommender must be from a math or science teacher, and 1 other recommender must be from a humanities and social studies or language teacher as well. And also for Duquesne, for example, they require only 1 letter of recommendation for health science applicants, but for all others, they might have other recommendations. So again, take a look at those specific informations and make sure that you're asking the right teachers at the right time. Again, develop a relationship with your counselor. They are here to help you and make sure that they're answering any questions that you are having about this process. And they'll also be writing a letter of recommendation. They'll be a little bit broader throughout your entire high school career and give the details that may not be applicable anywhere else. This should not have to be said, but here we are saying that you should definitely choose teachers who like you and know you, develop those relationships, have those relationships with them, because again, they're going to be able to write a better recommendation letter for you if they know who you are, as opposed to asking someone out of the blue just because you think it's the right recommender to ask, for example. I will say, though, that there are times that it does make sense for you to reach out to other recommenders, to have somebody maybe outside of your academic career to give a different perspective. And that's a very rare situation. But Jim, I know that you had a situation in high school where that made sense for you.
Yeah, so in high school, my freshman year history teacher who taught ancient history was also my head track and field coach. Now, I wanted to study the classics, which is Latin and ancient Greek, Greek and Roman history, mythology, all of that stuff. So ancient history was a very relevant subject. In addition to that, my main extracurricular activity was track and field, but I was a late bloomer physically. And what I mean by that is I was terrible at track and field until my senior year when I was a captain and the second highest scorer on the team. Now, the thing is, when your sport is spring of senior year and you don't have any accolades in the sport until then, it doesn't count for college applications, all of which are submitted by December, more or less. And so that means I was in this position where my main extracurricular activity that I was putting a lot of time into didn't really shine through on my resume. It just said JV, JV, JV. And it looked like I was just there to mess around after school or something like that. And the thing is, I wasn't. I was very dedicated. I worked very hard at it. And I was in a sort of leadership position. I would help coach other students. My coach would trust me to run our fully automatic timing system at track meets that we hosted. And so he could speak to this really kind of unique position I was in, where I was a leader on that team, despite having no on-paper accolades. And he was also a freshman year teacher of a subject that was actually part of what my intended major was going to be. And so because that was sort of like a twice exceptional situation, it made sense for me to involve him as a third recommender. Now, Jordan could tell you as a former admissions officer that you don't necessarily want to be giving more assigned reading to your admissions officers if it's not going to make that sort of crystal clear point that you couldn't kind of substitute for anything else. Because if I just said, yeah, but I try really hard to my JV, like who cares, right? Getting that third party insight matters a lot.
Looking out for my former colleagues, please do not send extra recommenders just because. But when you do go to send those extra recommenders, make sure that it's, again, a situation like Jim, where you're giving that extra information that can't be found anywhere else. Context is so important in this process, especially for letters of recommendation. And that's why when we talk about who to ask, look for students in that, or rather teachers in that junior core. Think about core subjects like English, history, math, science, foreign language. And also think about what field of study you're applying to as well when you think about what recommenders to ask. If you're going into a STEM heavy major and you have a great relationship with your math teacher, that will be a great recommendation, because not only can they speak to who you are inside the classroom and in your community, but they can also talk about how you are excellent at math and how you went above and beyond on this project, on this unit, on this specific subject, and show your proficiency in math. Again, there might be some exceptions. If you have the same elective teacher for all 4 years, think about that growth, or think about how they can talk to you and your development throughout high school. But for the most part, admission officers want to hear, again, from core subjects, also from the later half of your junior year, or rather from your high school career. You are not the same person as you were in 9th and 10th grade, so we being admission officers want to see what type of student you're going to be on campus, and you get that better from being in 11th and 12th grade. So again, think about those junior courses. When should you ask? Definitely ask before the end of junior year. Have that conversation with your teachers right now. This is an extra part of their assignments and of their responsibilities. So make sure that you're giving them enough time to write a really thorough letter and give them the information that they might need as well. They might have a cap as far as the number of letters that they can write or that they're able to write. I know that some teachers in my own high school said that you have to request it by this date, because otherwise I have way too many to write over the summer and into senior year, and I want to make sure that I'm doing a good job for you. So please ask me before then. And again, before you do that, make sure that you have those conversations with them and build that rapport with them. So when you do go to ask for a letter of recommendation, ask politely and directly. Again, make sure that you go to them in person and ask them to write a letter of recommender, or ask them if they would be willing to do that. Again, they might have different parameters. They might be already filled up. Make sure you have that conversation. Again, make sure that it's a good rationale as well, saying, I'm thinking of applying into to be an English major. I've really enjoyed your class both this year and last year for the core class and the elective. Can you please be a recommender and write about how I'm really great at English, or whatever you need to say to give that rationale behind it. Make sure you also provide a deadline as well. If you're applying to any schools with early action, early decision, or any earlier deadlines, and those letters of recommendation have to be submitted by that deadline as well, make sure you say, hey, is it possible to have this in by October of my senior year? Do you think you could get this to me by X date? Just make sure that expectations are set in the beginning as well. You can also provide them with a brag sheet, and that brag sheet is basically a summary of your accomplishments, of your experiences, skills, any other details or stories. Think of it like a broader resume, right? Not only the things that you've done, but also the rationale behind why you've done some of those things. Think about their classes too. If they've taught a lesson that you really enjoyed, write about why you wrote that, or rather loved that lesson, to make sure that you are able to think about, or rather they can include why you are interested in things like that.
By the way, we just had a question come in the chat. That's excellent. We're going to answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. So please, as they come up and you think of them, drop them in the chat, use the Zoom Q&A function. We're going to hang around as long as you all have questions. So please ask them. And with that said, we get to the very most exciting part of the entire presentation, which is standardized testing. Or at least my favorite part. I know Alyssa has something to say about that. But I like to start the conversation about standardized testing with the reason it exists and the reason it's a part of this process at all. This is especially important in this environment we're in, where so many colleges make these scores optional, right? So why were they ever required? Why are they still heavily used is basically the question. The standardized test score has been repeatedly shown by research done by colleges and third parties to be one of the very best predictors of a student's academic success in college. That's the bottom line of it. So the idea is that colleges want to predict what students are going to show up on campus and do well, what students are likely to actually graduate from their institution. And standardized testing is one of the best ways to do that. Standardized testing combined with high school GPA has historically been the best predictor, better than either high school GPA or standardized testing on their own. GPA has become somewhat less reliable, more on that in a minute. But the idea is that these scores help colleges figure out who's going to be successful, and so they use them for that reason. Scores also allow colleges to compare a student with their local context. And what's meant by that is that when you submit your high school transcript, or rather your counselor submits your high school transcript, a school profile is going to travel with that transcript, which contains certain information about your high school. On the course selection side of things, it will contain information on, for example, what AP courses or IB courses are offered. And so that means that students, if your school doesn't offer APs or doesn't offer a specific AP, so you can't take it, you're not penalized for that because the school is able to compare your rigor against the rigor of courses actually available at your school. And likewise, that school profile will contain the SAT score average or ACT score average of students at your high school, which allows colleges to compare your score with scores of students from a similar background at your high school. So the test score is part of a holistic review. It is one piece of the puzzle. No one, not even like people who love standardized testing like me, believe that a standardized test is an accurate, one number measurement of a human being. Obviously, we're way more complicated than that, but it is just one useful and important measure. Now, test optional has seen quite a bit of change recently. Many of you may have seen the article in the New York Times recently called "The Misguided War on the SAT." Very dramatic heading. But the idea here is that many college admissions officers, and I should say, deans of admissions, decision makers in this process, have seen the data on these classes of students that they've admitted test optional since the pandemic. And they've come to their own conclusions about it. So I have a quote from Emory's Dean of Admissions saying that they're less trusting of GPA these days. After what I told you about grade inflation, you could understand why. And Brown's president has said that standardized test scores are actually a stronger indicator of academic success at Brown than high school grades are. A professor at Brown, John Friedman, who's done a lot of research into standardized testing, its effects and their predictive value, has shown that test scores become more important relative to GPA as the academic level of students increase. Now, that makes a lot of sense because if you think about it, students who are applying to these, most selective institutions, they almost all have nearly perfect grades. There's very little to separate their GPAs. But the test scores are a little more granular in terms of what they can show you. So they're allowing students to separate themselves at that higher end more effectively. So when we talk testing policies, there are basically three to think about. Test optional, which is going to cover about 90% of the colleges our students apply to. Test required. When schools require tests, they typically fall into two main categories. One is large southern state schools, so the Florida State System, University of Georgia, University of Tennessee, etc. And then some of the most selective schools in the country, like MIT and Georgetown. Now, that doesn't mean all of the most selective schools in the country, all of the southern state schools require tests. Just that's sort of a tendency that those types of schools are more likely to. And then test blind or score free, which is very much a West Coast situation. The University of California, so UCLA, Berkeley, et cetera, and the Cal State system are the biggest adherents in terms of how popular they are with students. So when tests are required, you have to send them. Test blind, they won't even consider them. Most colleges fall in the middle with some kind of test optional policy. However, test optional is an umbrella term. It means different things at different places. So test optional basically just means that a college will accept your application fee and read your application, whether or not it includes a score. And that doesn't tell you anything about your chances of success with or without the score. So there are some test optional schools where over 70% of their freshman class submitted test scores. They're admitting students at a far higher rate when there are test scores included with the application. So we just have some examples listed here. Most of the Ivy Plus schools would fall into this category. The only exception, Ivy Plus just means, Ivy League schools and a couple other schools that are just about as selective as Ivy League schools. The only school in that realm that is below 70% is Stanford, which is on the West Coast. And on the West Coast, they tend to de-emphasize test scores a little more than in other areas of the country. And then there are schools who are very genuinely test optional, and they're admitting fewer than 30% of their freshmen with test scores. So it's not a coincidence that both of my examples here are from the West Coast, but even Temple University in Philadelphia, I believe, is at 32%. So there are schools all over where test optional means, very optional, that they believe they can do just as good of a job evaluating a student with or without the test score, with their philosophy and the way they do things. And there are other schools where it's test optional, but you're really, really going to help yourself if you can submit that score. Okay, so why would a college go test optional? And I think it's important for us to have this discussion just to contextualize things. Test optional gives colleges more flexibility in the students that they admit. So colleges are able to target what we call institutional priorities. Institutional priorities are students or categories of students that a college may want to select for reasons other than their academic performance and resume, for lack of a better way to put it. So for example, athletes, at some colleges, legacies, although that's falling out of favor, children of wealthy donors. Some colleges may have goals for the diversity of their class, a target for, first generation college students. State schools are typically going to, prioritize admitting a certain number of students from their own state before they're worried about out-of-state applicants. And so colleges are able to, focus in on these institutional priorities without sort of letting a test score keep them out. I put that all in quotes because part of the test optional game, I'll call it, is about the US News and World Report ranking algorithm, which some colleges are very incentivized by, others don't care about it so much. But the colleges who care about it a lot, they're trying to, rise in that ranking system, and they know what factors play into the algorithm. One of the factors is the average standardized test score for admitted students. And so by going test optional, they can make sure that, their football team's average SAT score doesn't have to bring down the overall school's average SAT score, just as an example. And then also test optional policies, when a college goes test optional, it's been shown to be a huge boon for the number of applications they receive. Now, if a college receives twice as many applications, the college doesn't get twice as large. So their acceptance rate goes down because they can't just house twice as many freshmen that year, right? And so the test optional allows them to sort of help themselves in the algorithm, both from the standpoint of the average test score and the acceptance rate, because a lower acceptance rate is actually going to help a school rise in the algorithm as well. Couple other things to note about test optional is that it's not always actually optional. So one of the most common things that you'll see with an exception to a test optional policy, most schools that are test optional are not test optional for homeschool students. Makes sense, right? We talked about the fact that grades are a cultural practice. Mom's grades are even more subject to cultural factors, we'll say, than, would be the grades of a school. And also some schools will be test optional for, some programs, but not for others. Elon University, test optional. If you want to be a nurse at Elon University, you're required to test. We actually worked with a senior this past fall who found that out on a tour in August. Was planning to apply to Elon, was totally ready to apply test optional, had great grades, great, medical related activities, thought she had a really good application, and then found out, wait a minute, I need a test score, and was scrambling to get it done this fall. Some colleges have, policies where essentially you can apply test optional if your GPA is above a certain level. If your GPA is below 3.6 and you're applying to Auburn, you must submit a test score. And then the final thing to note is that there are colleges that are using imputed scores in this process. And what imputed scores are is essentially a college using big data to predict a student's test score. So they'll do that based on their grades and academic rigor and demographic information and all the other mysterious things that go into a big data puzzle that spits out a predicted test score for that student. Now, bear in mind that when a college goes test optional, let's say they have a 50% submission rate. In other words, 50% of students who apply to the college submit test scores. The 50% who submit are the higher 50% of test scores relative to what that college has historically seen before test optional. Because the students who are above the average, why would they withhold it, right? And so that means that when a college is using imputed scores, they're starting from the assumption that if the score is above a certain level, it would have been submitted. And that means that when it's not submitted, they're assuming sort of it's somewhere in the bottom half of what we'd expect from test scores. And we need to use our data to predict where in that bottom half it would be. And so Cornell is the only school that's kind of been on record, kind of beating around the bush that they're doing this, but we can assume that other colleges are as well. There's not a lot of transparency into how colleges are handling this process, but the point is, and there is a sort of common sense level of it too. I mean, if two students apply, one of them submits a score and one of them doesn't, you're generally going to assume that the one who submitted a score scored higher than the student who didn't submit a score. So what's the bottom line? I just hit you with a lot of information about test optional, how it works, blah, blah, blah. So a strong score is still an admissions asset in a test optional world. And the more selective the colleges that you're interested in, the more important it is to have that score. And we would define a highly selective college as a college with about a below 15% acceptance rate. Selectivity is a spectrum, and so there are colleges who have a rate above that who are selective as well. But especially if you're targeting those most selective schools in the country, it's going to be important to have the score because you just need every chance you can get to distinguish yourself. Having strong scores will expand your options for both college choice and merit scholarships. There are colleges out there, like the University of Alabama, for instance, that has a site page where they just give you a table. They say, if your GPA is this and your standardized test score is this is exactly how many thousands of dollars a year we're going to give you to attend the University of Alabama. And so if you are especially targeting Southern state schools, they tend to be the schools that have these things very clear for students to see. I would highly recommend it because the scores aren't as high as you might think for merit scholarships. And it's a great opportunity to save, a couple thousand to tens of thousands of dollars, which of course we all want to do. And then I would be remiss if I didn't also mention, if submitting that strong test score, getting that strong test score in the first place would require so much of your time and energy that it would distract from your ability to do well in your courses, your ability to engage with your extracurriculars that are important to you. If it's just not in the cards for you and how you are as a test taker to be able to get that score, there are still plenty of options to be able to apply to college test optional. You just have to make sure to know the ways in which you're limiting yourself and potentially missing out on an opportunity. But that doesn't mean testing's for everyone. Everyone should do a ton of test prep, etc. That's not what I mean to say in the least. So with that said, let's assume we are testing, and I'm going to talk about the tests. The big buzz in my world over the past year that I've spent preparing for this thing, year plus really, is the digital SAT, of which the first administration in the US will be March. And this new digital SAT, the way it works is that it now has 4 sections. Really, there's a reading and writing section broken down into 2 modules and a math section broken down into 2 modules. And you'll get your traditional SAT score out of 1,600 with 800 points each in those verbal and math categories. The biggest challenges of the SAT, and bear in mind, I'm framing this relative to its competitor ACT that I'll talk about in a moment. The digital SAT has very limited annotation tools. And what I mean by that is that When you have a paper test like the ACT, you can write whatever you want, wherever you want. You can underline, circle, whatever you want to do to that paper, it's yours. The digital SAT has built-in annotation tools, but you have to use what the interface allows you to actually do in their application. So you do end up with fewer options for annotation than you do on a free-form piece of paper. The verbal questions of the digital SAT are generally more challenging than their ACT counterparts. So you'll typically need a better vocabulary to score at the very top of the SAT than you would for the ACT. And then finally, the SAT is adaptive, and I have a diagram to explain what I mean by that. The SAT, the digital SAT, it's a shorter test than the ACT, and they were able to shorten the test relative to the previous SAT by making it adaptive. So what that means is that every student will receive a module 1, and this works the same in reading and writing and math. I'm going to say math because it's fewer words. So everyone receives a math module of equal difficulty level to start. Based on your performance in math module 1, you will go on to either an easier math module 2 if you scored a little lower, or a more difficult math module 2 if you scored higher. And that will give you access to a different kind of outcome range of scores. So if you're looking to score as high as possible, you need to test into the more difficult math module 2. And if you score into the lower difficulty math module 2, that means that you will sort of put a cap on your score. So this is sort of a distinction without a difference. And I say that because if you get, on the old paper SAT, if you got half of the questions wrong in the first half of the math section, you would already be cut off from a 700 plus score. So it's a little bit of a distinction without a difference, because ultimately the scores are fair and they are just reflecting how the student did on the test. I've had a lot of students and parents ask me, like, how do you coach students around this? Is it possible that it would make more sense to try to miss a couple questions in module 1 and maybe a little bit of an easier path in module 2? And you can actually score higher in the lower module 2 than the lowest score you could get in the higher module 2. The truth is, though, you should just try to get more questions right. And getting questions wrong on purpose is going to hurt your score more than it helps it. That I can promise you. There is no magic to this adaptive algorithm. It's just the fact that you need to get more questions right to get a higher score. Practically speaking, not much has changed in that regard. But I do think that the adaptive nature of the test can mess with students' heads a little bit, which is why I put it in the challenges section. Now, when we move on to the SAT's competitor test, the ACT. So the ACT has 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science. Now, the English and reading sections of the ACT would correspond pretty much directly to the SAT's reading and writing. What the SAT calls writing, the ACT calls English. And then the ACT, instead of having the other half be all math, there's a math section and a science section. Science on the ACT is not a science test. It tests students' ability to interpret data. So they'll describe a science experiment, give you the data in a visual format, and ask students to draw conclusions from what's in front of them. So it doesn't require a high degree of outside science knowledge. If your student's not good at science, that's not necessarily a statement of how they'll do on ACT science, believe it or not. It's sort of a combined reading and math type task. The scoring of the ACT is out of 36, totally different scale from the SAT. And it's an average of those 4 scores, which will also be out of 36, then rounded to the whole number, meaning that a 27.5 is a 28. The biggest challenges on the ACT are timing. The ACT is faster paced. You get much less time per question than the SAT. Fatigue, because it's a longer test. And then the topics rotate more frequently on the difficult math questions of the ACT, which is to say the SAT has a more narrow topic range, but they take those narrow topics and make the problem solving and logic of the questions harder and harder and harder. On the ACT, they have this topic range for most of the questions, but then in the very hardest questions, that topic range will really expand. And so students need to cover a wider array of topics. It's still limited, finite, but there is a wider array of it. So it comes down to sort of how you want to try to improve in the math section, at least if you're trying to target the very high end. So with all these differences between the tests, how do you decide which one to take? The answer is to try both and see how you do. So we typically recommend before a student do test prep that they try a practice SAT and try a practice ACT. Our co-founder, Eric Carlin, who I know many of you in the audience know, he actually scored on the SAT in something like the 500s in the verbal section, which is ironic because he's a writing coach and wanted to be a journalist. But just the way the SAT tested the verbal sections just didn't gel with him. He took an ACT and got like a 35 on his first try. And really he did like 2 practice tests on his own and then didn't have to do test prep. Whereas if he just stuck with the SAT because he was from Connecticut and that's what people knew in Connecticut, he would have had a much tougher road to get a score that would, enable him to go to Penn where he ended up. So I say this, try both and see if you have a strength on one or the other. It's rare for there to be that much of a gulf between student scores. Certainly Eric's story is the far end. But there will be an easier path usually on one or the other, depending on where your strengths and weaknesses are. So I recommend investigating it if you haven't. We will send out a diagnostic ACT for students to take after this presentation. Once we have the recording rendered and on YouTube, so most likely on Monday, you'll see that from us. And so we will send that out. Any student who wants to try it, we'll grade it for free. Send us your previous results from the PSAT or the SAT, and we can make a recommendation for which test is likely to give you better results. Now, juniors, what I have here is your full menu of test dates for the SAT and ACT. So one thing I'll say is if you're preparing for the March SAT or the April ACT, it is time to start now for test prep if you haven't yet. You really want to start getting ready for that. The dates that I have highlighted in yellow are the last dates that are accepted by most colleges for their early action and early decision deadlines. So what that means is that most of our students will apply to at least one early action or early decision school. If you don't know what that is, drop a question. We'd be happy to address it in the Q&A. But the idea is that you'd like to plan to be completely finished with your testing by October or September of your senior year. And with these test dates, most of our students will test 2 or 3 times total because of super scoring, which is a policy that allows students to test multiple times and then combine their highest sub scores from the test to a new overall score. Many colleges do super score, but not all. So if a college does super score, it's in your interest to try to test again to see if you can raise any of those sub scores. Now, in terms of how we work with students on testing, I mentioned we do free diagnostic testing for any student. By the way, if you missed the PSAT, we can give you a diagnostic digital SAT as well so that you can try that testing format. But really the hallmark of our tutoring is that we meet students where they are. Our sessions are targeted on the exact problems students are having by looking at their practice tests and seeing what actual questions they're missing and comparing that with trends on the test to identify, for our limited time with the student, where can we get the most points for the time that they're putting in. We typically meet with students weekly, and then parents, you would receive an update email from the tutor after each session with details on when the next session is and what was covered in that tutoring session. So I'll hand it over to Alyssa for the extracurriculars. Now, thank you everyone for your immense patience while I talked about standardized testing.
So much math. So we're now starting to move into some of the more qualitative factors of the 5 factors under our control, although Jordan gave us a brief taster of, that with letters of recommendation. And I think one of the things that Jim really illustrated is for many of the quantitative factors, grades, rigor, standardized test scores, those are critical parts of the college application, but on their own, they often aren't enough. We've had conversations with admissions officer colleagues in Penn who have told us that when it comes to those quantitative components, that they could have taken their admitted freshman class, denied all of those students, gone back to their applicants and selected an entirely new class out of students that they had denied. without having the average GPA or SAT score change, which is a terrifying and anxiety producing statement to hear for, for parents, for students, for many of us. But the way that you distinguish yourself from those other applicants with the great SAT score, the great grades and rigor, is these qualitative components. I'm going to talk about the extracurricular activities for the moment, but also that's going to be letters of recommendation. That's going to be the essays and written portions of the application that allow an admissions officer to see who you are on a college campus, beyond just what kind of student you're going to be, but what kind of friend, roommate, club member, lab partner you're going to be. And extracurriculars are one of those components. Colleges are looking to see that students are engaged and interested in the world around them, that they're reaching out and connecting with others. And one of the ways that they can determine that is looking to see what a student is doing in their spare time. When it comes to, we often get this question about, is it better for my student to be well-rounded? And especially at this point in junior year, ideally during freshman year, students will have explored, tried a bunch of different things, learned what they liked and what they didn't. And during sophomore year, started to sort of hone down and refine at this point. And that can be in any kind of pursuit, whether that's athletics or creative talents. This can be in school or out of school. If you are a crocheter and that is something that you do in your spare time, that can show up on your college application. That can be intellectual pursuits, social justice, leadership and mentorship. What colleges are looking for is the depth of your engagement, looking to see how have you found the things that interested you and continue to pursue them in thoughtful and meaningful ways. Jordan, I think you told me once that admissions officers have a specific term for these kinds of applicants who really focus in on one topic, right?
Yeah, I always laugh whenever I hear it because you always hear about well-rounded and you want to do everything, which again is very much not the expectation, especially when we have students who are really great at a couple of things and instead of being well-rounded, they're pointy rather, that they are pointy in math, they're pointy in crocheting, they're pointy in ultimate frisbee, and those are the things that matter to them. So it's totally okay to have a couple different spikes or points as opposed to having to be this well-rounded person.
And sometimes we'll see that with our students who are engaged in really sort of high level athletics. There's this anxiety about, am I doing, enough other activities? I have 6, 7 activities on my Common App. There's blank space. Admissions officers know that you need to, eat, sleep, do well in school. There's a place to provide the number of hours that you engage in a particular activity on the Common App. And often what they're looking for in this case is depth rather than breadth. Which brings me to, as we move into the second half of junior year and the beginning of senior year, what can students do to engage now in order to build that kind of depth? And the easiest one is to build on things that you're already doing. Rather than joining a new club as a member, consider, running for a leadership position in a club that you're already part of and that is interesting and engaging to you. But this isn't limited to school-sponsored activities. If you are, fascinated by, by a STEM field, of course, Science Olympiad and those kinds of things can be really great and compelling ways to engage with this. But you can develop that interest outside of school, whether that's starting a podcast about quasars or other sort of astronomical phenomenon that fascinate you, whether that's, organizing a book club around STEM-oriented topics. That can be jobs or volunteering. I'm running out of Quasar related options for jobs and volunteering, but pursuing whatever it is that interests you in ways that go beyond the, well, I have signed up for the club that is available to everyone in my school. And one of the ways that that can be done is to utilize your time in the summer, whether that is applying to a summer program that is meaningful. If you are considering doing that, those deadlines are coming up soon, or taking that time to pursue one of your other passion projects, the podcast, the book club, the small business, in a way that is thoughtful and meaningful to you, because that really is what admissions officers are looking for and what we try and convey to our students. Our motto has always been that better person, better applicant, and that kind of authentic engagement with the things that a student is really interested in shows through in the application, in the essays, and the letters of recommendation, everywhere in the application.
So now that we've heard a little bit about the components of the application, and we're still going to talk about essays a little bit later, it's now time to talk about how you decide which schools you actually want to apply to. And there are quite literally thousands of schools in the country. There's just under 4,000 colleges and universities that give those four-year degrees. So there's a lot to choose from, and more than just the ones that you hear more often. We'll talk about some of those specific factors in just a moment, but you should definitely start with the factors that will help you limit the locations and the searching parameters that you're looking for when it comes to considering a college. It's okay to be kind of silly with them too. Think about the places that you want to be, the type of weather that you want to have year round. Do you like the school's mascot? Do they have this particular sports team or Frisbee team or activity that you want to do? I slide in Frisbee because I used to play Frisbee and it's a very fun sport. If you haven't done it, absolutely do it. But those things are okay to limit your college search around, because the college is going to be not just a place where you study, but it's going to be your home for the next 4 years. So I hope that you're able to find things there that you love and that you want to get involved in while you're there. Match and fit are kind of amorphous ideas that not only colleges consider, but also students and families should be considering as well. Fit is the idea that it makes sense for you to go there on multiple aspects, including the ones here. And that match aspect means that you are seeing yourself in a college or seeing how you can be a part of that college campus. Fit can be defined through different lenses, like the social lens as to what kinds of students go here. What's the kind of atmosphere on campus? Am I enjoying myself here? Can I see myself here? The physical lens is how far away is this from home? Am I okay with that? Do I want to be in the mountains? Do I want to be in an urban environment? Maybe some more rural? Financial, does this make financial sense for not only me and for my family, but also for my future career as well? Think about merit, financial aid, think about the cost of attendance and things like that as well. Are there expenses to get you there and while being on campus as well that you need to think about as well? And then the academic fit. And notice that academic fit is at the bottom here, because for a majority of the students who are going to apply to college, you might be going to a field that is kind of ubiquitous. You can study economics, you can study biology, you can study psychology at thousands of colleges across the country. So absolutely consider those academic pieces. And if you are applying to something specific like marine biology or aeronautical sciences, we can kind of give you those schools right now because there are a handful of schools that do that really well. But at the same time, think about these other factors, social, physical, and financial, while also considering academic, because they're just as important, if not more important than those academic ones. When we talk about the types of schools, there are three kind of categories that most schools will fall into: being a reach school, a target school, and a likely school. Reach schools are schools that it's essentially like buying a lottery ticket. You walk into a gas station, you scratch off, maybe you win, maybe you don't. If you do, amazing. I'm so happy for you that you won. That's kind of what it's like to apply to some of the schools with incredibly low admit rates. It is very unlikely that any single school or any single student will be admitted to that school. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the fact that there's a 7% admit rate, for example. One of the phrases that we talked about in college admissions is that if there's a 7% chance of rain, do you bring an umbrella? Probably not. But at the same time, that's analogous to the college admission experience. You should not expect to be admitted to a reach school, but if you are excited about it, if it makes sense for you to fit, if it's a match for you, you should still apply and put your best foot forward, absolutely. These categories are shifting depending on rather the kind of student that you are. If you are a really strong test taker and you have really great grades in academics and things like that, what's a reach to you might be a target to somebody else, and vice versa as well. For example, when we look at the types of schools, the University of Wisconsin last year had the 25th to 75th percentile for test scores be between a 1300 and 1440 on the SAT. You can also see the information there for the ACT and the average GPA. And with a 57% admit rate, that puts them in a likely school rather for a lot of students. However, depending on your student profile, student A, definitely likely because they're falling within that middle 50% of their testing and GPA. Rather they're falling above that. Then for student B, that's going to be a target school because they're falling within that. For student C, because they're falling a little bit below that, it might be a reach for them. So again, just because a certain school has metrics that you're seeing on their websites doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the same kind of school for every single student. When we talk about how many schools, we always hear that, oh, you should have a balanced list, 3 reaches, 3 targets, 3 likelies for 9 total. That's what you should be going for. Our philosophy is that regardless of the number of schools that you have on your list, you should have 2 to 3 schools that are within that likely range for you that you're genuinely excited about. Everybody sleeps better when the worst option is one that you're still incredibly excited about and that you want to go to and that you are really looking forward to attending. If you want to shoot for the stars, we want that for you. You should absolutely apply to all those schools. But just know that because you're applying to schools with lower admit rates, you're probably going to hear no more often. If you're okay with that, then let's go for it. If that's not something you think that you would be comfortable hearing about, then we can have conversations about identifying what those schools are, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But then also consider the amount of work that is required. If you want to shoot for the stars and apply to a lot of those schools that are in the most selective categories, you're most likely going to have to write multiple essays for them. Some schools will have 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 essays for that school specifically. So just keep that in mind with the work that you're doing your senior year, the other schools you're applying to, and whether that makes sense for your college list. So again, how do you know whether a school is a target, a reach, or a likely? Much like admitting a class, it's also a science and an art depending on how to find out that information. We're big fans of the mentality of teaching a student to fish so that they can find that information for themselves. And you have some resources in front of you, including Naviance, which is a school-based system that has a lot of data specifically within your school. And you can see prior years what students have and have not been admitted to schools, and you can see their metrics, see where they fall, but also know that you should be taking that with a grain of salt because, again, there are lots more factors, as we covered previously, that go into making an admission decision. Most colleges, a vast majority of colleges in the country, have to report something called the Common Data Set. And that's a lot of information about their incoming classes, their standardized test scores, their GPAs, things like that can help you get that information as well to see where you're falling within prior years admitted classes. When you look at that data, grades are more important than test scores. Again, a longevity of your high school career and your trajectory across high school is sometimes viewed as more important than just one single Saturday with a number 2 pencil or in front of your laptop if you're doing that digital SAT. Keep in mind that test optional is something that you can absolutely do as well. And again, consider the acceptance rate again of that likely school, rather of the reach school. If anything is at a 15% admit rate or below, it's again a lottery ticket. It's great if you get in, but it's not expected to be get in. Rather, that students should not be expecting to get in. Again, 15% chance of rain, 7% chance of rain, 9%. Do you bring an umbrella? Most likely not. Most importantly, though, when you're building your test or whether you're building your college list, be honest with yourself, not necessarily hopeful. You hope to get into Stanford. You hope to get into whatever school is on your list, but you should definitely not expect to get into these schools because, again, they are incredibly challenging for every single student to get into, regardless of your profile. When we talk about likely schools, though, we don't have to just hope to get into your likely schools. There are ways that you can actually enhance your experience. And as Jim mentioned beforehand, some schools will have metrics that you can look at and say this GPA plus this test score not only equals admission, but also equals a specific merit aid as well. Those 2 to 3 insurance policy schools, as we call them, should be ones that are great options for you, again, socially, academically, physically. And it's a great way to reduce anxiety and pressure in this process because it's also the most important aspect of the college list. Again, when your again worst option is one that you're still excited about, you can still have a great time there. Jim and Alyssa, I believe you had experiences at schools that were in your likely schools, right?
Yes, Jim, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. So my college decision in the end basically came down to NYU and the University of Pittsburgh. I knew I wanted to study classics and philosophy, and they were both top 5 philosophy programs in the country, and they were both in cities. And those were kind of my 2 main like considerations when I was forming my college list. The University of Pittsburgh gave me a full tuition scholarship. NYU gave me their biggest scholarship, which was half tuition, which would make NYU still more expensive than Pitt if I didn't have a scholarship. So for me, it was really a no-brainer. I was going to study the humanities. Paying back a lot of very expensive student loans didn't seem like the most realistic thing in the world. So I figured I would take the money and run, and I'm really happy I did. You know, met my best friends there. Yeah, University of Pittsburgh was absolutely the right place for me to be. And that's why I really push back against the wording of safety school. It makes it sound like it's plan B. All you're doing is trying to find schools you have a better likelihood of acceptance to. It doesn't mean they're any less than the other schools that you're interested in.
And I honestly love that you ended up at Pitt because it's such a great example about the importance of choosing your likely schools thoughtfully. Because for those of you who don't know, Jim and I grew up in approximately the same area. Our school districts were next to each other. But I wanted a much smaller experience than any of these sort of traditional big state flagship schools. So I didn't even apply to Pitt or Penn State. I wanted something smaller. I wanted something that was a more liberal arts oriented. So one of my likely schools, I can see Jordan giving me the evil eye from over there. One of my likely schools was Dickinson College, which gave me exactly what I wanted. I wanted a small school with a campus, but a town around it. I wanted the ability to study abroad in somewhere that was not Paris. I wanted to be, far enough away that I could come home for a weekend, but my parents couldn't show up without calling me first. Sorry, mom and dad. And Dickinson fit all of that for me. And because it was a likely school for me, they also were able to offer me a very substantial merit scholarship that brought the cost of that very expensive private school down to the price of Pitt or Penn State or one of the state schools that was much more within my family's budget.
Yeah, and that is a key point about these likely schools that, the more you sort of exceed a school's middle 50% of GPA and test scores, the more likely you are to receive those merit scholarships.
And now we are going to come into what I think is the most exciting part of this presentation. Jim, we can argue about this on Monday if you want. But that is the college essays itself, the written portion of the application. And one of the reasons why I love this part of our presentation to juniors is it is the part where I get to tell you that you're in good time. You have plenty of time. We are already working with students in some cases on essays, but we are working with them in a very leisurely pace because what is important for this part of the process is finding a balance between getting the essays written, the applications done, and living a rich and fulfilling life that also lets you attend to all of the other factors of your college application. Balancing having time to work on an essay and getting the strong grades that you need throughout senior year. Having time to do this and making sure you have that strong standardized test score if you don't already have it yet. Pursuing the extracurriculars that matter to you. So one of the best times to do that is to do the majority of the work in the summer after senior year. For those of you who want to get started earlier, we can do a lot of what I like to call runway clearing, taking care of the activity descriptions, talking about brainstorming, so that when we get into that, 2 to 3 months of empty time between the end of junior year and the beginning of senior year, students can really launch and start writing as quickly and as efficiently as possible. The reason why we do that is that ideally, the vast majority of the essay and application work will be done by the time senior year starts. The Common App will be releasing its prompts soon. Supplement essays come out throughout the summer. You really do have the option of maximizing your time getting that done over the summer, because when senior year rolls around, senior year grades are also really important. You don't want, you want those to be as good as your junior year grades. If not, hey, better's always good. And your student is going to want to enjoy being a senior, enjoy having those leadership opportunities of the clubs that they are engaged with. So summer between junior and senior year is a really great time to focus on those essays. So what are the essays that a student needs to write? We're primarily going to focus on really 2 of these in this presentation, but I wanted to give you a highlight of some of the others as well. The first is the personal statement, or the Common App essay. That'll go to almost any school that a student applies to. But some of the common supplement or school-specific essays that students might write are: why college or why major? Why do you want to study thing X at school Y? Questions about personal identity or a community that you belong to. Elaborations on your most important activity, or sometimes there are just miscellaneous essays that are kind of fun to work on. The University of Vermont asks you what ice cream flavor you would be, which is always one of my favorites to work on in August when it's really hot and you get to spend an afternoon thinking about ice cream. But of these, the most important one is going to be the personal statement. So when we say personal statement, we use that fairly interchangeably with the Common App essay. That's going to be that 650-word essay that goes to almost every college you apply to. If for some reason your student is using the Coalition app, you will be responding to almost exactly the same prompts. It's just a little bit shorter. But in any case, this is a rare opportunity for a student to speak to an admissions officer in their own words and with their own voice and introduce themselves, talk a little bit about who they are, their heart, their soul, their personality, who they're going to be on a college campus, and how they see the world. So it is this crucial window into who a student is outside of all of the different metrics, which means coming up with an idea is often going to be one of the most difficult and crucial parts. We often say that the most important work of an essay comes before the very first word goes on the very first page of the very first draft, and that is the brainstorming process. It's the most important, it's the most fun, coming up with ideas and angles. But the first way we do that is by casting a wide net. There is no arguing in brainstorming. We send students a blank page titled with, "What do I need to know about you?" And we really want everything down there. What a student's parents think, what a student's friend thinks, what the student thinks, hobbies, traditions, rituals, your favorite color. We have had students write about why their favorite color is orange and pink. And stories. We absolutely want to know that funny thing that happened in 10th grade with the kayak. because that allows us to truly get to know a student as they are and start getting to know them and thinking through how an admissions officer would get to know them. And those ideas can come from one of really two places. This can be, your activities, your resume, activities, jobs and internships, volunteering, meaningful stories that come from there. But remember, the Common App has places to talk about your activities and what you've accomplished. Often the best personal statement topics will come from what we call toast topics. And in that case, when we say toast, I'm not talking about sliced bread, but in this case, if you were to want to celebrate someone, raise up your glass and I'd like to give a toast to. And usually at that moment, you're not going, I'd like to toast to this person who got a 5 in all of their AP exams, as impressive as an accomplishment as that is, but you're speaking to who that person is. Are they the mom friend that always has chapstick and snacks and Band-Aids in their backpack? Are they the person that has been disassembling their parents' phones since they were 5 and now has grown up to build things and work with their hands in a way that is unique and thoughtful and engaging? These are the topics that don't show up anywhere else on the application and that allow us to really see who the student is. One of the most common questions we get is, what are good topics and bad topics? And although it sounds like from this slide that I've been going, your resume is going to be your bad topics, there are no bad topics. There's bad ways to handle topics. A lot of students love to write about camp. It's meaningful for a lot of students. And there is sort of a basic narrative arc of, I went to camp and I was homesick, and then I learned a little bit about the camp, and then I felt better, and now I'm a counselor in training, and I'm helping other people do that. And while that's still a meaningful story, what happens is that essay goes with all of the other camp essays that are telling the same story, and it's much more difficult to rise above that. But what we help students do is find the angle to the camp stories. Maybe it's about the first time a student learned to build a fire and realizing that the exact angle that you hold the steel matters when it comes to starting a blaze, and that, once you have that ember, you have to start small and feeding pine needles and bits of paper, and we are about to learn how bad of a Girl Scout I was. But it becomes a metaphor into realizing that small gestures add up into big things, that pine needles in the exact angle of a steel can get you a bonfire if you're careful and you pay attention. So ideas can come from a lot of different places. It's how you use them that ultimately ends up well. And if anyone wants to talk more about this, I will happily rant for the next 15 minutes, but I do want to be mindful of other people's time and talk a little bit about the most common type of supplement essay that comes up, and that is going to be the why college essays. So in this case, we put up some common examples from Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania. And you can see in this case, these are very classic, why you want to study, what you want to study here. And this gives you a way to talk about not just yourself, but how you would fit in on a college campus. And the most common question that we run into here, and one of the most common anxieties, I think, for students is, what do you do when you don't know what you want to study? And in that case, it is absolutely fine to be undecided. But in this case, it is all right to be undecided. It's not okay to be uninterested. What the goal for is with supplement essays is you walk into a buffet restaurant, and the goal is, I am so hungry, I don't know how to put together a plate because everything looks good, rather than going into a restaurant and going, I don't know, I guess I could eat. And that means for undecided students, the steps that you're using in many ways are still what a student who knows what they want to major would be. Talking about past experiences, the ways that you've engaged academically, meaningful moments, and future goals. And that how you might explore those on a college campus. So in many ways, I'm going to borrow Jim's phrase here from the SAT. It ends up being a distinction without the difference, because you still are talking about the things that intrigue and engage you academically, whether you've committed to one of those things or not. When it comes to how we work with students on this process, we coach students throughout the essay process from the very beginning. You've had a taste of some of the college advising advice that we give, all the way through unlimited drafts and unlimited meetings on any essay or application that students choose to work with us on. We are project managers. We keep track of all of the moving parts and all of the moving parts and all of the balls that are in the air at the same time, so that all of the essays and applications are done well in advance of, those big looming external college deadlines. And we do that with unlimited support, meetings, and feedback. This is a very individualized process for students, and we strive to respect that. Some students take 4 drafts of a personal statement. Some students take 14. We are with them the entire way, because it is a student-driven process. Students have to write the essays. It has to be their voice and their work. Admissions officers are looking to get to know them and who they're going to be on a college campus. If it sounds like someone else, whether it be an essay coach, an English teacher, a parent, has been changing the way they write, it makes it harder for admissions officers to get to know the students, which is ultimately what the essays are hoping to do. Outside of the essay work, we do also offer college list services and interview prep as add-ons, but that is primarily how the essay work goes from the very beginning to the very end. And Jim, I think you had a checklist of, we're going to set you all homework of what you want to do as we move in the second half of junior year.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for hanging around for so long. We will get to Q&A in a second, but I wanted to just, since I know we kind of overloaded you with information over the past hour and 20 minutes or so, just run down okay, wait a minute, what needs to happen between now and the end of the year? So first of all, keep that focus on keeping your grades as excellent as they can be, and don't lose sight of that. Make sure before the end of the school year that you're asking those teachers for letters of recommendation. Finish your SAT or ACT testing if your testing timeline allows for that, or just make sure you have your final plan for what's going on this fall if you're going to need to test again. Or if you're, not going to have your score yet, if you're taking one of those June test dates, have your contingencies in place. Okay, if I get this score, I'm happy and done. If I get that score, I'm going to take the September ACT, and here's the goal there. Continue to deepen those extracurricular interests. Run for a leadership position senior year if it's a school club. Deepen your involvement in whatever ways you can. And then finally, if you are interested in working with us on essays and applications, I dropped links in the chat. You can book directly into Alyssa or Jordan's calendar using those links, your choice. You really can't go wrong between the two of them, if I do say so myself. But I say this not to put the pressure on you guys or have too much of a sales pitch, but just to say that we do book up over the summer. A lot of people come to us fall of senior year and want to work with us. And unfortunately, we have to strictly limit the number of students we take in a year so that we can give that high level of individual attention to every student. So make your decision as to whether or not you're going to work with us before the end of the school year to make sure we have space for you, because we'd love to work with you. And with that, thank you all so much, and we're going to jump into Q&A. So for Q&A here, I'll be moderating, and I'll kind of address the questions around to myself, Alyssa, and Jordan based on the topics and who would be the most relevant person to answer. Our first question, Jordan, a question on recommendations. If you're undecided on your major by the end of junior year, how do you make a connection with a teacher in a specific subject area if you aren't sure what your intended area of study actually is?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that piece of advice is great for students who know exactly what they want to do. If you don't know what you want to do, then at least gravitate towards those teachers from the later half of junior year in those core subjects that you have a great relationship with. Even if you end up applying for something that's maybe not what the teacher is recommending, and you're still following the colleges and universities guidelines, then going with a teacher that you have a strong relationship, you can't go wrong with, because they're going to be able to speak to you generally. And admission officers are able to take off the lens of, oh, this is a math teacher, or this is an English teacher, depending on what that recommendation says. So go with the closer relationship. Don't worry so much about the subject.
Good advice. All right. The next thing I want to respond to is a comment on the test optional stuff. And I believe there was a little bit of a misunderstanding, so I apologize if I misspoke. But this person seems to think that 70% of students who submitted test scores were admitted to those schools. And I want to be clear that the percentages I was referencing were the percentages of their admitted students who included test scores with their application. So it's not exactly the same thing as saying that you have a 70% chance of getting in if you submit a test score. To Alyssa's point about Penn rejecting their whole freshman class and bringing in the next 2,500 students, the test scores wouldn't change, which means that's not really mathematically possible that 70% of students who submit test scores are admitted. So I just want to make it clear that the point I was making is more in the spread of students admitted to that school that did or did not have scores. And for every college that has released this data, which is precious few of them, the students who submit test scores are admitted at a higher rate than the students who don't submit test scores. Very few colleges admit this and release the data, but it is true everywhere that the data has been released. I haven't seen a single point to countermand that. Alyssa, I think you might have misspoken at one point during the college essay timing slide, because we had a confused question, but could you just clarify which summer does most of that college essay work take place?
Yes, so that is the summer after junior year and before senior year. So if your student is a junior now, we are talking about, the May, June, July, August of 2024.
And then a follow-up question that came with that. What would be the advantage of having an initial consultation now if most of the work that a student does is going to take place over the summer?
So what that allows us to do, and I alluded to this in my presentation, is I call it runway clearing. It really allows us to get to know the student, to build a relationship with them, and to have those college advising conversations that we might not get to have if I'm meeting with a student, in late May. You won't necessarily get my advice on course selection at that point because you've probably already selected your courses for junior year. We're coming up on summer at that point. So, we can certainly have conversations about summer plans, but there's much less room to maneuver if you want to reach out to a professor about, possibly interning with them or applying to summer programs. And even when it comes to the essay work, although of course we want students to focus on, those absolutely critical junior year grades, we can start small and take care of bits and pieces of the application, whether that's leisurely writing the activity descriptions, deciding whether or not a student needs the additional information or COVID section, brainstorming for the personal statement, even writing an outline so that when a student is really ready to start the bulk of the work, we're not starting from square zero. We're starting with that rolling start that allows them to hit the ground running and really maximize the summer.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. Jordan, if you think you want to study econ, would the AP econ teacher be a good person for a recommendation, or would it be better to stick to core teachers?
Yeah, that is a great question. I would say yes, generally, right? That econ and social studies and things like courses in that subject are still seen as core subject classes. So I wouldn't shy away from that as teacher just because they may not be the traditional core, what you think of being English, math, and science. But again, social studies is still something that teachers will see as rigorous. So absolutely go for that teacher, but only go for that teacher if that teacher actually knows who you are, right? You should have those relationships. You should not only be doing well in their classes, but if you, again, when I was an admission officer, I would say that if you just sit in their class, you raise your hand occasionally and you get an A on the tests, that's not as good of a recommendation, or rather that teacher can't write as good of a recommendation. If you, for example, maybe aren't doing so great in that class, maybe you want to get a little bit better, you stay after school to ask for extra help. They also advise a club. That teacher's going to know you a lot better than just you raising your hand. So yes, go for that AP Econ teacher because that still counts as a core subject, but make sure you still have the relationship too.
Yeah, and I will say that I think the confusion in a question like this comes from the fact that AP Econ is presented as an elective in the course catalog, and you think like core classes versus elective, but social studies is a core subject area, and econ is a social studies AP course, meaning that for our purposes of letter of recommendation heuristics, it counts as a core subject course, even if your school presents it as an elective and says, actually, you have to take US history junior year. And AP Econ is optional. It's still a core subject. Awesome. Alyssa, how important is it to participate in the new diversity essay question?
So I think there are really two parts to this question. The first is about, many colleges have quote unquote optional essay questions, and then a question about how do you respond to, an essay question that seems like a diversity question when you may or may not feel like you have anything to say. So, and let me preface, this is about the supplemental questions. I'm not talking about the additional information and COVID sections, which are truly 100% optional. Please don't put anything in there if you don't have anything to add. Your admissions officer doesn't need any more assigned reading. But when colleges offer optional supplement essays, it is usually a good idea to take the opportunity to share as much as possible about yourself and take advantage of those spaces and answer all of the optional questions that a college provides. Sometimes, as in the case of, the diversity questions, though that can seem difficult, but I think it's important to note that for many of these questions, colleges are taking a really broad sense of what diversity is in this case, where they're looking for elements of lived experience, of background, of family structure. They're looking for what it is that makes a student who they are. And while that perhaps can be a question of, of race or of ethnic background or of religion, there are other components that make a student unique to who they are. I think last year, University of Virginia had a great example of one of these prompts, and it was, what element of your lived experience will serve as a source of strength for, for you on our campus? And we had students who wrote about being a big sister, both within their family, but also being the big sister in clubs and having that role and how that would be a source of strength for her on the college campus. We have a lot of resources when it comes to brainstorming for these types of questions, but I'd really encourage you to think very broadly about what it is about your background, your life, your story that makes you, a unique person and what would serve you on a college campus.
Thank you, Alyssa. Next question. How well do you know Philly area high schools in order to advise in course selection? How those schools might be viewed by colleges? So I will just take this one and say, to the person who asked this question, we work with several students who attend your very high school, which I happen to know from our conversations. So we do know them quite well. Course catalogs, it's not like we have every course catalog for every high school in the Philadelphia area memorized necessarily. So we do ask for students to share whatever they can in that regard with us. But we would definitely be able to give good specific advice about course selection in the way that those types of things will be viewed by colleges. All right, those are all of our questions. Thank you to everyone who hung around through the end of Q&A. You are troopers. We're going to be sending out, like I mentioned, a follow-up email. It'll include the links for signing up with Alyssa or Jordan. It will include a link for a consultation with me if you'd like to talk about a plan for test prep tutoring or academic subject tutoring, as well as links to sign up for that. As far as when the recording will be emailed, we hope Monday, but sometimes YouTube can take a little while. By the end of the day, Tuesday at the very latest. And please feel free to forward the email along to any friends or family, because we put this information out there because we know how challenging this process can be, how untransparent it can feel. And a lot of times, 5 minutes of talking to one of us can save you like 2 hours of Googling and give you a better and more definitive answer in the end as well. So anyone you want to share it around to, we'd appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to talk to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.